Why did Cecil B. DeMille's adopted son grow up to look just like him? Why did Ben Affleck and Matt Damon blow through their very first $600,000 Goodwill Hunting check? And why, oh why, is there an abandoned Frank Lloy'd Wright house that hasn't officially been lived in since 1997? Well, let's go find all of those answers on Glencoe Way. This is a really great example of what I often talk about on these tours. When you see a house, not from right here, but from its street address, and you have absolutely no idea what you're looking at because it's all hidden. That'll make a lot more sense when we get to the top of the stairs and see a little of it from there. Plus, I can't just stand here filming over their fence. That's rude. My point anyway is that you just sometimes have no idea how big or small some of these homes are when you pass them on the street. Like this one, it just goes so deep. It's actually an apartment complex. 3, maybe 4 units, all built in 1924. How about that? Live to be 100 years old, only to have to face something that looks like it belongs on a beach in Orange County. Ugh, I don't even want to look at it. Sorry. It just doesn't belong here on Glencoe Way. Not across from something as old and charming as this little cluster of hillside apartments, or all the ones that surround it for that matter. Glencoe Way, it's old in the great ways that old should be. It's gritty. It's not run down. It's just more lived in. That's the best way I can describe it. Lived in. It's seen some shit, you know? And so did poor Cynthia Hobart, starting back in the summer of 1933 when she was living here at 2034 Glencoe Way. The 28-year-old, she reported that her dog was poisoned to death. One of many dog poisoning incidents that seemed to be going around that summer. Cynthia, she was a stunt double for ice skater turned actress Sonia Henney and for Claudette Colbert, but that career was cut short after she fell off a horse and sustained a major injury. So she turned to writing, where she eventually found some success, using the name Cynthia Lindsay, her third and final husband's last name. She wrote a biography of actor Boris Karloff, who she knew quite well. She also helped legendary George Burns co-write his autobiography. She wrote a handful of books. She also wrote TV movies and teleplays before moving into series television with 4 episodes of My 3 Sons and 2 episodes of Family Affair. All 3 of her husbands were in some form of show business, but she actually lost her second husband, an actor named Russell Gleason, the day after Christmas in 1945 when he accidentally fell out of a hotel room window in New York City. Also that day, though, Cynthia's brother died in a plane crash. Her brother and her husband, same day. Cynthia, however, carried on. She became pretty well known for hosting parties and entertaining at her home in Malibu. She lived to be 91, dying in 2007 at her home in Santa Monica. All right, unfortunately, we have to look at this one again. I mean, look, it's a beautiful building if you live in the city or, again, at the beach. I just think it's kind of rude here. And look, I'm not some sort of purist. I like modern, I like progression, just where it's appropriate. I don't think it belongs here. That belongs here, though. Pick up after your dog. Everyone. All right, so we are approaching about the midpoint of Glencoe Way. When we came up from those steps, we could have turned right back there, but we're going to head south instead. And I don't know what the residents think about this worn down, unpaved, lived in, narrow, tiny way. Maybe they love it. I love it. I'm not even sure people know that you can drive up here, which I'm sure the residents love that part. But really, it's the only way to get to the next few houses, and two of its residents were amongst the biggest stars in the entire world to drive home on this narrow little pathway when they were living up here in the 1990s. They're still two of the biggest stars. It's really a fantastic little stretch of quiet road that is about to give us a great view of pretty much everything we've learned on this tour thus far. The High Tower and Elliot Gould's house, so unique and identifiable, but also kind of lost in the mix, just sort of blend in. But we get to see a lot more of the ones we saw up close, like Halo Meadows' house and Morgan Woodward's next to it, the mayor's house, which sits so high up on the hill. Also, one of my top favorites, the Hugo Hirchhofer house. All the great houses on Rockledge Road. And if we pull back, we get a little peek of the Hollywood sign, as well as the observatory in Griffith Park. Love a view where you can see both of them together. And the neighborhood we're looking at is Whitley Heights. I actually did a series on that as well. It was back during the pandemic, though. I was primarily just making them for Instagram. That barn there, that's in the tour. It's one of the very first movie studios, now a museum sitting on Highland Avenue, across from the Linda Ronstadt Park. Anyway, check out that tour if you haven't, but I used all the music from Instagram and the levels are all off. It's not my best. I've gotten a lot better at editing since then, but it's a really, really great old neighborhood with a lot of show business history. How funny. The LAPD had their sights on a resident who was living in this 1935 built house back on September 2nd, 1955. And while I would love to tell you what this art installation means, I have no idea, but I love it. Clifton Wallace Cole. That's who was living here back then. He was the manager of a movie theater at 6656 Hollywood Boulevard, and if you saw a movie at his theater back on August 31st or September 2nd of 1955, well, you know what you saw, you dirty bird. You saw a two-night screening of 1938's The Unashamed. Well, a judge felt that Mr. Cole should be ashamed for showing it at his theater because, and cover your ears, it contained naked people. It took place and was filmed at a nudist camp in Lake Elsinore, and the judge would not hear of such lewd content being shown here in Hollywood. Could you imagine? So Clifton, along with his projectionist, got arrested. Not dramatically, not by helicopter. The defense attorney was like, relax, Your Honor, this movie has been shown all over the country, and it even once played at a theater across the street from the White House. But the judge wouldn't budge, and they were sentenced to a year's probation and a $50 fine. Poor Clifton, though, just sitting inside this house, dealing with the stress of all this, and here I stand almost 70 years later, talking about it on a device that will then transmit to your device, where you will so effortlessly see a clip of the very film that got him in trouble. What a wild world we live in now. I was just about to say, and now for some modern history, something more current, but no. This is shockingly almost 30 years ago. Insane. But this Spanish-style house in front of us, built in 1985, not that old. A very large 4,000 square foot house with 4 bedrooms and killer 360-degree views was once the home of 2 big-time movie star buddies. In fact, they paid to live here with their very first big check that they would receive from their very first big movie, which, ironically, I'm just realizing, came out in 1997. Good Will Hunting. Matt and Ben called this home for almost a year. Matt Damon started writing the story of Good Will Hunting back at Harvard as part of a course on playwriting. He asked his pal, childhood pal, Ben Affleck, to co-write the script with him, which they completed in 1994. But even though it was the launch of Ben and Matt as we know them today, they had both been working before that movie launched them into superstardom. Matt, he was born on October 8th, 1970, in, of course, Boston. And when he was 3, his parents divorced. His mom moved them to Cambridge, where eventually a 10-year-old Matt would befriend his 8-year-old neighbor kid who lived 1 block away. Ben Affleck, he was born on August 15th, 1972, and the 2 new neighbors discovered they shared a love for baseball and acting. So they played Little League together and took acting classes together. They would both attend the Cambridge Ringe and Latin School, where they'd perform in plays and turn their passion into a career. In 1986, they started saving up money and even started a joint bank account together to basically fund their dreams. They would use the money that they put in it to go on auditions, which would sometimes mean taking a train all the way to New York City. I mean, they were really serious about it. Matt, he got himself a small part in Mystic Pizza in 1986, but really didn't do anything for him. It should have, but nothing happened. Ben, he had started acting at age 9 in TV movies and in after-school specials, and the 2 boys just kept auditioning, and in 1989, they signed up to be extras in Field of Dreams. Apparently, the boys got to make their way down to the field and had some time to chat with Kevin Costner, who Matt said was very generous with his time and was a really nice guy. Well, Matt, he went on to college at Harvard, and Ben moved out to LA at 18 to attend Occidental College. The two ended up getting small parts in 1992's School Ties, starring Brendan Fraser and Chris O'Donnell. I remember loving it when it came out. I wonder how it holds up today, though. I could not tell you a thing about it, but I think it was good. Well, the following year, Matt came to LA to film Geronimo, an American Legend, which co-starred Robert Duvall and Gene Hackman, and he met up with Ben, who was living here in LA, specifically Eagle Rock. He crashed on Ben's couch and showed him a script that he was writing based on his story from Harvard. Ben made some suggestions, and they embarked on this back and forth script writing process that eventually led to the screenplay for Good Will Hunting. And during this time, Ben filmed a part in 1993's Dazed and Confused. Well, the Good Will Hunting script was finished in 1994, and Rob Reiner's Castle Rock production company bought the script for $600,000. Pretty big sum, even back then. Ben and Matt, they thought they were set for life. They moved from Ben's Eagle Rock place, and they bought themselves Jeep Cherokees, and they rented this house. While they were living here, Rob Reiner told them, "Look, your script is great, but it's two movies. You have a thriller about a Southie kid trying to take down the government, and you have a drama about a math genius and his relationship with his shrink. You have to pick one." So they rewrote and rewrote and rewrote while living here, and they also spent. The two were broke within a year. To make matters worse, Castle Rock said, "You know what, this isn't working. Sorry, but as long as we get our money back, we'll let you sell the script." So, after rewriting some more, they started shopping the script around town, and it began attracting all sorts of buzz. There began a bidding war. Well, the boys, they threw in a scene about halfway through the script. A scene where two characters, the Robin Williams character and the Stellan Skarsgård characters, out of nowhere start masturbating with each other. They only put it in the script for one reason: to see who actually read the script. They took meetings after meetings after meetings where none of the executives would even mention the scene. Finally, one man did. You know where this is going, and it's so ironic, and it's so cringy. But director Kevin Smith, who had read the script after working with Ben, loved it. He loved it so much that he personally took it to the head of Miramax, Harvey Weinstein himself, who agreed to a meeting. When Matt and Ben sat down with Harvey, he said, "Boys, look, I love your script, but I have one question. What the hell is with the two guys masturbating?" But that is when Matt and Ben knew that Miramax was the right studio. And they accepted Harvey's offer of $1 million. And look, you don't have to leave in the comments how awful Harvey is. I know. I'm not glorifying anything about him. He's vile. He's awful. But he also doesn't get to tarnish the brilliance of Good Will Hunting, the brilliance of Robin Williams and Minnie Driver and Stellan Skarsgård. Just because he was a monster, I'm sorry, it's not fair to Matt or Ben or any of the people involved. Well, it took a few more years to get the movie made, and in the interim, the boys went broke, left this house, and returned to Boston. Obviously, Good Will Hunting went on to film in the spring of 1997, opening at the end of the year, and it went on to receive 9 Oscar nominations for Best Picture. Gus Van Sant got nominated for directing, Minnie Driver for supporting, Matt for lead, Elliott Smith was up for Best Song, and Danny Elfman for the score. It also got nominated for editing as well, and of course Robin Williams won for supporting, and of course Matt and Ben took home statues for Best Original Screenplay.
We did share a bank account, and always thought it was perfectly normal. We wanted to be actors, and we were in Boston. We wanted to go to New York and, take the train up to New York and pay for that to go audition, because that's where you could audition. So we would work a little bit. We would do extra work or a line here and there, the occasional Burger King commercial, and then take that money and put it in the account. And we were friends, and we wanted each other to succeed, and we love each other. And so it seemed like clear, like, let's do this together. And it's actually, in retrospect, really valuable, because I think kind of starting out in a field like that can feel very lonely. But we shared that bank account like into our 20s, even into when we lived and wrote Good Will Hunting in a house in Eagle Rock, which is a neighborhood in Los Angeles, which was at the time a very inexpensive neighborhood and very far from all the places you had to go to audition and all that stuff. And then when we sold Good Will Hunting, I was like, we are now rich for life. My needs are over. I will never have to work again. I'm rich forever. We sold it for $600,000. We split that, $300,000 each, and then the agents got $30,000, so we had $270,000, and we paid about $160,000 in taxes. So we had $110,000. We each bought $55,000 Jeep Cherokees, and then had $55,000 left, which naturally we decided to rent like a $5,000 a month party house on Glencoe Way up by the Hollywood Bowl, and we were broke in 6 months.
I know I was a little hard on that glass house that we saw at the top of the stairs earlier, but these last two houses here on Glencoe Way are both, well, I guess what you'd call modern additions to a very old neighborhood, and I think that they're both good examples of how you can do it. At least Matt and Ben's has a style akin to the area, and this one across from it was built in 1992. They're new, but they don't stick out the way that the other one does. Also, what have we learned on this tour so far? That dead ends don't always mean dead ends if you're on foot. Can you believe it? Another hidden path. And this one gives no indication that it's public, except there's no sign that says it's private. And most people will put up signs letting you know when their steps and sidewalks are private property. I accidentally walked up someone's steps in Beechwood Canyon once, apologizing to this lady sitting on her deck, and she was like, no, my sign fell down and I keep forgetting to get a new one. People do it all the time. She was really nice about it, but just look for signs and be cautious when exploring old Hollywood neighborhoods. We're actually still on Glencoe Way, but there's this little carless stretch, probably so confusing for deliveries. It's not that long. It's just a link, really, between the two drivable stretches of Glencoe Way. Also gives us another nice, quiet view of the Hollywood sign again. Same view of what we just saw earlier, except a little bit more south. It's funny, if I ever got a chance to interview Matt or Ben, people would be so mad at me, because instead of asking about their relationships or J-Lo, I'd be like, did you guys love that little path by your house? And then I would make them listen to all the history about their neighbors, specifically this little pocket over here. I would tell them that this spot, this hillside that we're on, right behind this big building, which is now a Hilton Hotel, I would tell them that it was the setting for a Carpenter's album cover, and neither of them would care. But if you do, you can learn all about it in my Carpenter's tour. Remember that movie Hidden Figures? Came out like 5 or 6 years ago, about the African American women who were the brains behind a huge NASA operation but never got the credit, hence the title Hidden Figures. Well, you can make a sequel. Actually, you could make an entire franchise series on a lot of hidden figures throughout time, and someone who deserves her own movie would be Gladys Rosson. But we kind of have a little mystery on our hands, because Gladys lived at 1979 Glencoe Way, and this house is numbered 1977. I'm going to walk back this way just a little bit to show you that, well, first of all, there is no 1979. It jumps from 1977 to 1983. And honestly, there's really no room for a 1979 to have been here and torn down. There's no history anywhere of a 1979 Glencoe Way except in 2 searches that I found, and both of them pertain to Gladys. So I'm pretty sure it was her address. And what I think most likely happened is that this house was probably once a duplex or divided into multiple units, which is why it would jump to 1983 next door. That's my guess anyway. You're still gonna get the story of Gladys because she deserves it. Because she was the machine behind one of the most important, influential, trailblazing directors in Hollywood history, Cecil B. DeMille. Artists are still receiving the Cecil B. DeMille Award at the Golden Globes each year. His name is still very prominent all throughout Hollywood history. And look, I am not saying at all that Gladys was the brains behind DeMille, but she ran his career from the very beginning. She graduated from high school in 1914, and that summer she began working for DeMille, which was also the year of his very first film, The Squaw Man. And Gladys did not stop working for him until her death in 1953. For nearly 40 years, the majority of her life, she was Cecil's right-hand woman. She handled his finances, his business affairs, his appointments, all the things a good secretary does, because that was her title. But she also invested his money. She scouted filming locations. She served as a stand-in on his set, sat in on meetings, gave input, helped make huge decisions. She also ran his house, his life, all of it. And yes, much, much more. She did become his mistress. See, after DeMille's wife gave birth to their only biological child, doctors told her that there was potential that she could die if she ever tried to carry a baby again. She was very religious, so this meant no sex. It also meant no divorce. So Cecil and his wife Constance had this arrangement where these mistresses, which were actually referred to as his harem, weren't so secret. She knew he had a sexual appetite and that he was satisfying it elsewhere. It didn't interfere with their marriage because they stayed married for 57 years and even adopted 3 more children. Gladys never married or had any kids. She devoted her entire life to Cecil B. DeMille. And I have to mention that their affair didn't happen until 20 years into her career working for him. That's a very long time to work for someone before getting intimate. And I say that because I believe that he really respected, admired, and maybe even loved her. He either really appreciated her or she had a lot of dirt on him, because DeMille made sure that every single one of Gladys's siblings found work in the industry. Her baby sister Helen Rosson had a 10-year run as a silent film actress, appearing in over 35 films from 1915 to 1925, and their sister, Queenie Rosson, she was also an actress. She appeared in 20 silent films, mostly shorts. Their brothers, Richard and Arthur Rosson, were both film directors. Arthur worked second unit for Cecil himself, but it was their brother Harold Rosson who found the most success. He was a cinematographer with a 52-year run, beginning in the days of silent films, working his way up to the 1960s with a few extremely impressive notches along the way. Oh, like 1939's The Wizard of Oz and 1952's Singing in the Rain. Not to mention, he once bore the title Mr. Jean Harlow. Harold and Jean, they were only married for just under a year in 1933. Their divorce didn't become final until 1935 because after they decided to separate, Harold contracted polio, and he was quarantined right here in the home of his sister, Gladys. Now, Jean Harlow's drama, it didn't come from Harold, her third and final husband. It was actually her husband before this one who should get his own story location tour because it is a real mystery. But Harold here, he was granted a grace period by Jean so that he could recover. Well, shortly after bouncing back, he received an honorary Oscar for his work on a David O. Selznick film from 1936 called Garden of Allah. The following year, the death of his ex-wife, Jean Harlow, absolutely shocked the world. She was struck down in her prime at the age of 26. Harold, though, he would live until the age of 93, passing away in Florida in 1988. Gladys, she passed away in 1953 at her home in Beverly Hills. She was so loyal to DeMille. Never talked to the press, never spoke anything negative about him, always publicly respected him. Cecil B. DeMille only outlived Gladys by 6 years, dying in 1959 at the age of 77. And if this doesn't say it all, he is buried just a few feet away from Gladys Rosson in the Hollywood Forever Cemetery.
Dead at 77, Cecil B. DeMille, a founder of Hollywood who became legend in his own time. The notable screen spectacle was his trademark. He has estimated that his films have been seen by more than 5 billion people. Many international honors came his way during his long career as director and producer. He earned the coveted Academy Award, his Oscar announced by a beloved pioneer among stars, Mary Pickford. Mr. DeMille himself developed more stars than any man in the industry. From his first film, The Squaw Man, which marked Hollywood's beginning in 1913, he made more than 70 films. His last, for which he supervised production, was The Buccaneer. Now, he himself has reached the end.
If you are Wikipedia, you call this next house the Samuel Freeman House, but if you're just en route, you call it the Harriet Freeman House. In some cases, I've actually seen it called the Samuel and Harriet Freeman House. But it's really because of her you're even going to get to see it today, even if it is in the saddest state that it's ever been in, completely lacking any dignity whatsoever. A real shameful way for something so unique to be celebrating its 100th birthday. We are in front of one of only 4 textile block homes in LA that were built by Frank Lloy'd Wright. These, of course, are the blocks right here. 12,000 of them make up this house. And the craziest thing about the whole house to me is that each block has a different design, its own unique design. No 2 blocks are the same. And I really don't want to, I know it can be obnoxious to go on and on about things, sounding so pretentious, like drinking wine with people who are like, the tannins and the bouquet, it's all so crisp and balanced. And you're like, oh, just drink it. But I could do that with this house and the architecture of it all. It's really an honor to get to stand in its presence and share it with you. I just wish we could get inside to show it to you. The way it hugs the hill and caters to the views of LA. It's really the interior that is so spectacular. The spacing, the ceilings. The ceilings. They're so over the top. And in anything larger, it would be overwhelming, like you were living in a museum. But this house is only 2,800 square feet, so it works. It's actually the smallest of the 4 homes. But it is the glasswork that turns me on. Yes, in that way. The windows are so sexy, so permissive. I know, rich, flavorful bouquets. But seriously, though, this house was the first in the entire world to have corner-to-corner glass windows. I don't know how anyone can be certain of that, but they are exquisite. And anytime I see them on any house, anywhere, I get so, don't slide into my DMs with your nudes. Slide into my DMs with pics of your corner-to-corner windows. Someone once asked Wright why he chose to work with concrete blocks, and he said it was the cheapest and ugliest thing in the building world, so why not see what could be done with that gutter rat? He also wasn't a fan of the Mediterranean craze sweeping through the Hollywood Hills. He said, keep the Mediterranean style where it is, the Mediterranean. Let's do something more indigenous to the area. He was really interested in the connection between Mexico and its influence on Los Angeles, dating all the way back to 1781 when this city was founded. He was also very interested in Mayan culture, and he wanted to integrate their style of living off of the land. He didn't just put a house down anywhere. He really took in account every aspect of the land, and his goal was to give the American family an option to live like these people used to live, but in a more modern, practical, and functional way. That's where the Freemans come in. You'd have to be pretty eccentric to live in a house like this, and the Freemans were, both of them. Harriet Press, she was born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1890, and after a stint in New York, she moved to LA with her sister Leah in 1919. 2 years later, she met Samuel Freeman, who had been living in LA with his family since the age of 17. Now 32, a year older than Harriet, he was part owner of a jewelry shop in downtown LA. Harriet, she was a dancer who made most of her living as a dance teacher. She taught night classes at Hollywod High and even taught contract players and chorus girls at various Hollywood studios. The two were married and shared a common passion: entertaining and hosting parties. They wanted to build a home that could serve as a sort of a community gathering spot for artists and creative intellectual types, perhaps with an open door policy. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they wanted something unique and spacious. Well, after visiting Frank Lloy'd Wright's recently completed Hollyhock House on Hollywood Boulevard, they knew that he was the man to bring their vision to life. Frank Lloy'd Wright agreed to build the Freemans their dream home. He asked for 3 months and $10,000, which equals about $185,000 today. Also, his son, Lloyd Wright, who we met earlier on this tour at the Hollywood Bowl, he would serve as the construction manager, basically overseeing everything. But years later, Harriet would say that Lloyd was incompetent, and she blamed him for the house taking 13 months with a final price tag of $25,000, more than double what was promised. But the Freemans had their dream home, even though they were so broke by the time they moved in that they used cardboard boxes for furniture. Took them a few years to rebound, and when they did, they hired architect Rudolph Schindler to make some changes and improve upon their house. So when Schindler came along, he built permanent furniture into the house, like benches and tables, and converted a part of the house into a separate apartment. See that handrail on the wall? They're covered under that black covering, but there are steps that go down because, remember, we're on a hillside. And that was the main entrance into the house on the right, behind that green door that seems chained up. But Schindler, he also added 2 separate apartments in addition to the house. One apartment was created by converting 2 already existing rooms, but he also built an apartment below the garage. Because, see, the coolest thing about this house is it appears from street level to be 1 story, but it's actually a 3-story home. So now, basically, the house could be lived in by 3 different people with their own living quarters, which was very convenient considering Samuel and Harriet decided to separate. But get this, neither of them was willing to give up the house. I don't think it was really like the Kathleen Turner, Michael Douglas movie War of the Roses, because Harriet, she spoke very highly of Samuel after he passed away, but they just agreed to live separately in the same house for 60 years. Clearly there was a lot of love still there. They never had any children, but I don't think that either of them were covering for one another, sexually, I mean, because they were both very open and very liberal and very political and very outspoken and artistic. And from what I've read about them, I sense they wouldn't have hidden anything about themselves. It's honestly the rotation of tenants and visitors and guests that the Freemans catered to that really bring this house to life for me. For starters, Richard Neutra, who would go on to become an iconic architect in his own right, frequented the house and ended up building a house for Harriet's sister, Leah Lovell, and her husband, Philip, just a few years later. That is called the Lovell House, and it sits in Los Feliz, where it was once a setting for my favorite film, LA Confidential. Two sisters, two extraordinarily important homes. Martha Graham, one of the most influential dancers and choreographers in the world of dance, was also a visitor to the home, which is a statement on how respected Harriet was in that world. There's a very long list of influential dancers and sculptors and artists and architects who frequented this house, to be honest. And like I said, it was a melting pot for artists and creative types. One of the tenants who rented from the Freemans was Jean Negulesco. He lived here in the 30s with his wife when he was a struggling filmmaker. He would go on to direct Jane Wyman to a Best Actress Oscar in 1948's Johnny Belinda, and he also directed Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Wagner in 1953's Titanic, long before the Kate and Leo version. I think maybe his biggest movie was How to Marry a Millionaire with Marilyn Monroe, Betty Grable, and Lauren Betty Bacall. Jean also directed Joan Crawford in Humoresque in 1956 and in 1959's Best of Everything. He's another one of those names you'll see with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and now you'll be able to say that you saw his house once. I also have to tell you about an actress, a forgotten actress who lived here, Helen Walker. Helen Walker was born on July 17, 1920 in Worcester, Massachusetts. She began acting in school plays and eventually moved to New York to take it more seriously. Her first substantial gig was as Dorothy McGuire's understudy in a play, but Dorothy never missed a performance. But 1942 was a huge year for Helen. The 22-year-old was cast in a leading role on Broadway in a play called Jason. When a talent scout from Paramount Pictures saw her performance, it was next stop Hollywood, and Helen was whisked away and found herself with a leading role on screen in a feature film comedy opposite Alan Ladd, who would also be experiencing a lead role for the first time in his own career. The film was a really big success, and Helen was now a promising new star in Hollywood. That same year, she met an executive at Paramount, and the two fell in love and got married the same year. Helen, unfortunately, got thrown into a lot of thankless roles after her big break, playing what she called a reactress, simply cast to play off her male co-stars who were provided with all of the film's comedy, like William Bendix, Niles Astor, Dennis O'Keefe, the Tin Man's Jack Haley, and one of my favorite guys, Fred McMurray. Helen, though, was frustrated that she wasn't getting more exciting roles, and if you were a female star under contract who dared complain, you were labeled difficult. And if you were labeled difficult, you were let go, and if you were let go, you were Helen Walker. Helen got a divorce in 1946, but hadn't left her love of drinking, something she acquired while married. According to actress Yvonne DiCarlo, Helen was a bad influence on some of the other actresses she was known to hang around with. Well, on New Year's Eve, 1946, Helen was driving back to LA from Palm Springs in a convertible belonging to her new boyfriend, film director who had directed her in The Home Stretch, Bruce Umbersom, who everyone called Lucky. As Helen drove along Route 99, she picked up 3 hitchhikers, all soldiers. Now, you have to remember, this was almost 1947. Hollywood had gotten really used to supporting the troops and supporting them however they could. It was not uncommon for people to pick up hitchhiking soldiers. But while you still might be thinking it was probably too unsafe for a young woman to pick up 3 strange men, it was actually their lives that were in danger. Helen had been drinking, and the car slid off the road and tumbled a reportedly 6 or 7 times, ejecting all 4 passengers out of the topless car into the dark night. One of the men was killed instantly, and the other 2 men, both 18 years old, suffered really serious injuries. Helen, though, she broke her pelvis, her clavicle, and crushed the bones of her toes and foot, which required a month recuperating in a hospital. The 2 survivors told police that Helen had been driving like an animal, despite their pleas for her to slow down and that she smelled like booze. Well, she was charged with manslaughter. However, they weren't breathalyzing back then, so there was no evidence that it was anything other than an accident, and the case was actually dismissed. The 2 young men, though, they sued her for their injuries, and it just broke her. Even though she wasn't found guilty of any crime, Hollywood did not welcome her back with open arms, and she was known as the actress who killed a hero. And I hate to say it, but her work after the accident is honestly the work that I find most interesting. She knew her comedy days were over, so she sort of embraced the negativity and went in for darker, more villainous roles in the film noir genre, a genre I could watch on a repetitive loop. She starred in a great film. Oh, it's actually the original Nightmare Alley, opposite the dashing Tyrone Power. I mentioned both of the Powers actors back at the bowl, Tyrone Sr. and Tyrone Jr. This was Jr. in Nightmare Alley. I could also watch him on the loop. The movie is more respected now, but Helen's career really, it just didn't go anywhere, and the parts got smaller and smaller. One notable role, though, was a supporting one in Call Northside 777, opposite Jimmy Stewart. That was released in 1948. Also that year, she survived working with Kirk Douglas in My Dear Secretary. Check out my Jean Spangler story for more context. And in 1949, she made another fun noir called Impact. Helen, now only approaching 30 and living in this house, was out one day when she met a man on a street corner, 41-year-old department store executive Edward Domain. He apparently asked her if he could take her to the beach sometime, and she accepted. The 2 fell in love and got married on April 28, 1950. Edward, though, apparently hated her movie friends and didn't want her working. Helen only put up with 2 years of that nonsense before telling him to hit the bricks, and they divorced in 1952. Her career, though, really slowed down, and in 1955, she made her last movie, a part in a Cornell Wilde movie called The Big Combo in 1955. She retired from film acting at the age of 35. She had moved out of this house and had made a few television appearances, including an episode of Dragnet in 1960, the same year that her house burned down. She lost everything, but a few of her Hollywood pals, including Hugh O'Brien, Dinah Shore, Ruth Roman, and Vivian Blaine, put on a benefit to raise money for her recovery. Sadly, though, during all of that, Helen was diagnosed with jaw cancer, the same disease that took out Marion Davies. Helen battled it, though, for several years, and she ended up passing away in a small North Hollywood apartment on March 10th, 1968, at the age of 47. Edward Weston, one of the most innovative and prolific photographers of all time, lived here at one point. I think his most famous photo is the Nautilus from 1927. He also did the nude 2 years before that. Cuban bandleader and musician Xavier Cugat lived here. So did Albert Decker, an actor who would later be found dead in the most unusual, really one of the most mysterious deaths. His wife found him hanging in his closet, dressed in women's clothing with all sorts of awful things written all over his body in lipstick. Money and expensive belongings were missing, but there was no sign of foul play. Police ruled it a suicide and then decided it was an accidental death. Very, very strange. Even wilder is that his wife went on to create TV's The Love Boat. From over here, you can see the house's 3-story secret and the separate entrance to the apartment below the garage. Something also worth mentioning is that this house, its style, it just didn't change much over the decades. Harriet decorated it with things that she would pick up while traveling around the world, but for the most part there wasn't really much you could do. You can't paint, you can't wallpaper, the furniture for the most part is permanent. You really only have accessories to give it any intentional style. It's really hard to believe that a house that has been around for 100 years only had one family ever own it, the Freemans. Despite the numerous guests and tenants, the Freemans remained the sole owners for almost 60 years. Samuel, he died in this house in 1981. Like I said, though, Harriet spoke very highly about him, and she was also known to take credit for Frank Lloy'd Wright blossoming into the renowned architect he went on to become. Harriet, she passed away in 1986 when she was 96 years old, also in this house. Since neither of them had any kids, Harriet left the house to the USC School of Architecture in addition to $200,000 for its upkeep. The house had been declared a historic landmark and a historic monument, so it was left to USC under the conditions that it cannot be altered or remodeled, unless you're the 1994 Northridge earthquake, which did just that. It caused permanent damage, and the last resident to live here after Harriet was someone from USC, but they moved out in 1997, and no one has lived here since. USC continued to maintain and own it, however, even opening it to the public for touring and visits up until just a few years ago. USC also managed to get involved in a scandal involving the house. Apparently, some of the lamps and furniture designed by Wright and Schindler were stolen while they were being stored at USC while this house was undergoing some maintenance. It was apparently unreported, though, and the LA Times found out, and they called the school out. It was a really big mess. I read it a while ago, and I don't really remember enough of the details to tell you anything more, but you can Google the Times article. It's only a few years old. Regardless of the theft, USC could not maintain this house. I mean, Harriet's $200,000 didn't last long either, so the school sold it in 2022 to a man named Richard Weintraub. Believe it or not, he only paid $1.8 million for it, and along with this house comes the very strict rules that it must be preserved. So here's to hoping that Mr. Weintraub can pull off something amazing and hopefully very soon. There's a puzzle piece missing in the story of the Freeman's next door neighbor. Rosalind Schaefer, who was born in 1920, moved into this house with her family when she was just a little girl. She grew up heavily influenced by her neighbors, particularly Harriet, who inspired little Rosalind to take up dancing, which she did quite well. She studied extensively for years and turned it into a career, specifically ballet, and she found work dancing in the movies. In 1940, she somehow crossed paths with Cecil B. DeMille's youngest son, Richard. Now, this is where there's a piece of the puzzle missing, because I don't know if they met on a set somewhere or if Rosalind's neighbor up the hill, our friend Gladys Rosson, had anything to do with it. Either way, the young couple saw each other for 3 years before eventually getting married in 1943. Rosalind was 24 and Richard was 21. All right, how about this? Well, first, Richard and Rosalind DeMille, they stayed married for just over a decade, divorcing in 1954. The following year, Richard's father, Cecil B. DeMille, lost his brother, William DeMille, who was 76 years old. You are not even ready for this. In the wake of William's death, Cecil revealed to his son Richard, your Uncle William, who just passed, wasn't your uncle. He was your father. See, William, who had been married, had an affair with a novelist and a screenwriter named Lorna Moon. Lorna, she wrote for Gloria Swanson, Norma Shear, Greta Garbo. So, as to avoid a scandal, Lorna quietly and discreetly gave birth, and Cecil B. DeMille adopted, technically his nephew, and raised him as his own son. I mean, how shocking to find that truth out. Richard never even got to talk to either of his real parents because Lorna died in 1930 at the age of 43 from tuberculosis in an Albuquerque sanitarium. Oh, the crazy's not over. Before Rosalind and Richard divorced, he wrote and directed for KTLA, a television channel here in town, leaving them in 1950 for this new religion called Scientology. Yeah, he worked side by side with the founder, L. Ron Hubbard, and he even helped, this is a true story, he even helped L. Ron Hubbard kidnap his wife Sarah in an attempt to declare her crazy. L. Ron was a crazy one, but sure. The two men had successfully kidnapped Hubbard's daughter and flew her to Cuba. They got the wife too, but eventually released her in Arizona. I mean, the whole story is batshit. Look it up. I don't really care to talk about it anymore. It's gross. They're gross. It's no coincidence that Rosalind divorced him in 1954 because the following year, Richard said he saw the light. He left Scientology behind and he never looked back. He ended up dying in 2009 at the age of 87, and Rosalind DeMille, who never changed her last name, also died in 2009 at the age of 89.
I think that Harriet and Sam had a new vision of the world, and that's one of the things that must have driven them to make this place. Sam used to make long speeches to us, which we couldn't understand at all, but that were interesting to us because Sam was such a nice guy.
Of the many frequent visitors, Roz DeMille remembers Romanian director John Negulescu best.
He was a very handsome, courtly gentleman. And my mother used to go out to empty the garbage and he would come out and bow to her. She loved that.
I'll sound probably a little hypocritical here, but I do not hate this modern house that was built in 2022. I know I hated on that other one and said that new ones don't belong in this neighborhood, but I don't know, this one's not that bad. Kind of like the clean lines, but I mostly don't mind it because it fits the house next to it. Not this Spanish one across the street, but the white one, the one that's right next to it. At first glance, you might think that this house was also built recently, but in fact, it was built in 1940 by Rafael Soriano. It's named the Cusis House, and it is considered a gem of post-war modern architecture. It was recently painted this fresh coat of paint too, so it looks really new, but it's a 2,400 square foot home, 3 bedrooms and 2 baths, and it's actually a landmark property. To be honest, it's one of those houses you kind of really don't think much about when you drive by or walk by, but if you stop and admire it, you can really kind of see the art behind it. We have reached this end of Glencoe Way, finally, and we find ourselves at Hillcrest Road. But guess what? We have a lot more Glencoe Way to visit.